Hello, and welcome to ZzZscience. Wherever and whenever you're listening from, I hope you're doing well. Take a moment to get comfortable. There's nothing you need to focus on, nothing you need to stay awake for. Just let your body relax and let your mind slow down. If you feel like it, you can tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And if there's a science topic you'd like to gently fall asleep to, I'd love to hear it. For now, let's slow things down and begin. You take a step forward, and the distance ahead seems to close. But something remains. You step again, and again the distance shrinks, but never completely. There is always something left. A gap that refuses to vanish. A space that holds its ground, even as you move through it. This is not a trick of perception. It is not a failure of effort. It is something about the nature of moving itself. Something about how distance behaves when you try to cross it. Imagine walking toward a wall. You cover half the distance, then half of what remains, then half again. With each step, you come closer. The wall is real. Your movement is real. And yet, if you only ever cover half of what is left, you would seem to never quite arrive. The mathematics of it are simple. Half, then a quarter, then an eighth. The numbers get smaller. The fractions pile up. But they never quite reach zero. And yet, you do reach the wall. You touch it. You arrive. The paradox is not that arrival is impossible. The paradox is that it seems impossible, and yet it happens anyway. This is not about mathematics failing. Mathematics describes the situation perfectly well. The infinite series converges. The sum approaches a finite value. The explanation is clean and clear. But the feeling remains. The strangeness does not dissolve just because the numbers make sense. You can know how something works and still feel unsettled by it. You can understand the explanation and still sense that something about the experience refuses to be captured. The paradox lives not in the logic, but in the gap between logic and the texture of moving through space. When you walk across a room, you do not think about halves. You do not calculate distances. You simply move, and the room comes to you, or you come to it, and the arrival feels seamless. But if you pause and consider what is happening, if you slow down your attention and examine the act of crossing space, something shifts. The smoothness starts to look fragmented. The continuous starts to look divided. This is what happens when the mind turns toward motion itself. Motion, which seems like the most ordinary thing in the world, starts to feel strange. Not because motion has changed, but because attention has changed. You are no longer moving through space. You are watching yourself move. And in that watching, the experience splits. There is the movement as it feels, and there is the movement as you think about it. These are not the same. When you think about movement, you divide it. You break it into pieces. You imagine it as a sequence of positions, one after another. You picture yourself here, then there, then somewhere further. The mind does this naturally. It sections time. It cuts space into manageable parts. This is how thought works. It takes the continuous and makes it discrete. But motion itself does not feel discrete. It feels smooth. It feels like one thing, not many things. When you raise your hand, you do not experience 1,000 tiny positions between down and up. You experience a single arc, a flow. The hand moves, and the motion is whole. So there is a tension. The mind, when it reflects, sees steps, but the body, when it moves, feels flow. And the paradox arises in that tension. Not because motion is impossible, but because the way we think about motion and the way we experience motion do not align. This misalignment is not a flaw. It is not something to fix. It is simply a feature of what it means to be a thing that moves and also thinks about moving. A creature that lives in time and also reflects on time. A mind embedded in a body, embedded in a world. The thinker who noticed this, long ago, was named Zeno. He lived in a time when people were beginning to ask these kinds of questions. Not practical questions about how to move, but philosophical questions about what it means that movement is possible at all. He did not have modern mathematics. He did not have calculus or physics in the way we understand them now. But he had attention. And he turned that attention toward motion, and he found something troubling there. He described several situations. A runner trying to reach a finish line, an arrow in flight, Achilles chasing a tortoise. In each case, he showed that if you divide motion into steps, into smaller and smaller pieces, something seems to go wrong. The runner must cover half the distance, then half of what remains, and so on, forever. The arrow, at any single instant, is not moving. It occupies a space exactly equal to itself. It is still. And if every instant is a moment of stillness, how does motion ever happen? These were not meant as puzzles with answers. They were meant as observations, as ways of pointing to something uncomfortable in the way we think about the world. Zeno was not confused about whether people could walk or arrows could fly. He knew they could. What he was questioning was whether our usual way of thinking about motion made sense, whether the concepts we use to describe the world were adequate to the world itself. And this is important, because the paradoxes are often taught as if they are simply mistakes, as if Zeno did not understand limits or calculus, as if the problem is solved by better math. But that misses the point. The math does solve the technical problem. It shows that infinite series can sum to finite values. It shows that motion is mathematically consistent. But it does not make the strangeness go away. It only relocates it. Now, the strangeness is not in the math. It is in the fact that motion, which feels so unified and simple, requires such intricate mathematical machinery to describe. It is in the fact that something so ordinary needs infinity to explain it. The paradox shifts from being about whether motion is possible to being about why motion feels the way it does, given what it actually involves. You stand at one end of a room. The other end is 10 meters away. You walk. It takes you a few seconds. You arrive. This is normal. This is every day. But consider what just happened. You crossed a distance. That distance can be divided infinitely. Between any 2 points, there are infinitely many points. You passed through all of them. In a few seconds, you traversed an infinity. That is strange. Not impossible, but strange. The word infinity usually suggests something vast, something unreachable. But here it is, woven into the smallest, most mundane act. Walking across a room means completing an infinite task, and you do it without effort, without even noticing. This is not a metaphor. It is not poetic language. It is a literal description of what happens when you move. Space is continuous. It does not have gaps. Between here and there is no smallest step, no indivisible unit. There are always more points, always more places in between, and yet you pass through them all, continuously, smoothly, as if infinity were nothing. Perhaps the strangeness comes from the fact that infinity is an idea, not a thing. It is a way of talking about endlessness, about processes that do not terminate. But the world does not seem to care about our ideas. It does not pause to resolve the infinite. It simply proceeds. Motion happens. Distances are crossed. And the infinity is there, woven into the fabric of it, but it does not obstruct anything. This suggests something about the relationship between our concepts and the world. Our concepts are tools. They help us navigate, predict, understand, but they are not the same as the things they describe. The map is not the territory, and sometimes the map reveals features that seem impossible, but the territory contains them anyway. Mathematics describes motion using limits and infinitesimals, using the idea of getting arbitrarily close without ever quite arriving, and then defining arrival as the limit of that process. This works. It is rigorous. It produces predictions that match what we observe. But it is also, in a sense, a workaround, a way of handling infinity by transforming it into something finite, a way of thinking about the continuous by approximating it with the discrete. The world does not need this workaround. The world simply is continuous. Motion simply is smooth. The infinity is not a problem for the world. It is only a problem for thought, for the part of us that wants to break things down, to count them, to make them manageable. And maybe that is what Zeno was pointing to. Not that motion is impossible, but that our way of thinking about it, our instinct to divide and count and sequence, runs into trouble when applied to something that is fundamentally undivided. Motion is not made of steps. It is not a collection of positions. It is a single, continuous process. And when we try to think of it as a collection, we generate paradoxes. But we cannot help but think this way. Our minds work by categorizing, by separating, by making distinctions. This is not a flaw. It is what allows us to think at all, to have concepts, to communicate, to build understanding. But it means that some aspects of experience will always slip through the net of concepts. Some things will always feel stranger than they should, given how ordinary they are. Consider the experience of time. Right now, you are reading these words. Time is passing. Seconds accumulate. Minutes go by. But what is a second? What is a minute? These are measurements, divisions we impose on the flow of time. Useful divisions, but still divisions. Time itself does not come pre-divided. It does not tick, it flows. And yet, when we think about time, we picture it as a sequence. Past, present, future. Moments lined up one after another. We imagine ourselves moving through time, or time moving past us. But this picture, helpful as it is, may not capture what time actually is. It may be another case of thought dividing what experience presents as whole. When you remember something, you do not travel to the past. The past is not a place you can visit. When you anticipate something, you do not leap to the future. The future is not yet real. There is only now, only this moment. And yet, now is not a frozen instant. It is not a single point. It has a thickness, a duration. Now includes the immediate past blending into the immediate future. It is a span, not a dot. This span is where you live, where experience happens. And within this span, motion is continuous, change is smooth. The divisions we make, the instants we imagine, are not actually present in experience. They are present in thought, in the way we reflect on experience afterward. So the paradox of motion is also a paradox of time, because motion is change over time. And if time is divided into instants, then motion seems to require jumping from one instant to the next. but there is no jumping. There is only flow. The instants, like the points in space, are useful fictions, tools for thought, but not the substance of reality. This does not mean time and space are illusions. They are real. Motion is real. But the way we conceptualize them, the grid we lay over them, is a human addition. A way of organizing experience so that it can be thought about, talked about, measured. And sometimes the grid does not fit perfectly. Sometimes it produces artifacts, paradoxes, feelings of strangeness. And these feelings are worth attending to. Not because they reveal errors in the world, but because they reveal something about the relationship between mind and world, about the limits of concepts, about the places where language and logic stretch thin and experience continues regardless. Imagine watching an arrow in flight. It moves through the air, it traces a path. At any moment, if you could freeze time, the arrow would be somewhere. It would occupy a specific location. At that instant, it would not be moving. Movement requires time, and an instant has no duration. So, in any frozen moment, the arrow is still. But the arrow is moving. You see it move. The stillness of the instant is a feature of how we think about time, not a feature of the arrow. The arrow does not experience instants. It does not exist in a sequence of frozen moments. It exists in continuous time, and in continuous time, it is always moving. This is another version of the same paradox. If you break time into pieces, motion disappears. But time is not actually broken into pieces. That is something we do when we think about time. The pieces are conceptual, not real. And so the paradox arises from the act of conceptualizing, not from the nature of motion itself. But again, we cannot help but conceptualize. We cannot experience time without some sense of before and after, some sense of sequence. And once we have sequence, we have division. And once we have division, we can generate paradoxes. It is built into the structure of thought. This suggests that some paradoxes are not solvable in the usual sense. They cannot be dissolved by better definitions or clearer logic. They are inherent in the act of thinking about certain kinds of things. They are the price we pay for having concepts at all. And perhaps this is why Zeno's paradoxes have persisted for so long. Not because they are unanswered, but because the answer does not eliminate the feeling. The feeling that something about motion, something about the crossing of distance, remains elusive, remains strange, even when we understand it perfectly well. There is a difference between understanding something and feeling that you understand it, between knowing the explanation and feeling satisfied by the explanation. The paradoxes live in that difference. They point to a gap between intellectual comprehension and intuitive grasp. You can know that infinite series converge. You can follow the proof. You can see that there is no logical contradiction in crossing an infinite number of points in finite time. But you might still feel a flicker of unease, still sense that something about the situation is odd. And that feeling is not ignorance. It is not confusion. It is a recognition that the explanation, while correct, does not fully dissolve the strangeness of the phenomenon. This is common in physics. In quantum mechanics, for instance, particles behave in ways that defy intuition. They can be in multiple places at once, in a sense. They can be entangled across vast distances. The mathematics describes this accurately. The predictions match experiments, but it still feels strange. Physicists have lived with these ideas for a century, and many still find them counterintuitive. The universe is not obligated to match our intuitions. Our intuitions evolved to navigate a world of medium-sized objects moving at medium speeds. They did not evolve to handle the very small, the very fast, the very distant, or the very abstract. So when we encounter phenomena outside that range, it is natural for them to feel strange. Natural for there to be a gap between what we know and what we feel. Zeno's paradoxes sit in a similar space. They involve the very structure of space and time, of continuity and infinity. These are not things we have direct everyday intuition about. We move through space, we live in time, but we do not perceive their fine structure. We do not see the continuity. We do not experience the infinity. We simply move, and it works. It is only when we stop and think, when we try to analyze the process, that the paradoxes emerge. And they emerge because the tools we use to analyze, logic, language, mathematics, divide what is undivided. They impose structure where there may not be structure. They try to capture flow with snapshots. And snapshots, no matter how many you take, do not quite become flow. You can take an infinite number of photographs of a moving object, one for every instant, and you will have an infinite collection of still images. But you will not have motion. Motion is not in any single image. It is not in the collection of images. It is in the transition from one to the next. But that transition, that between, is precisely what is lost when you divide time into instants. This is not a criticism of the method. It is just an observation about its limits. Analysis is powerful. It allows us to understand, to predict, to build. But it works by breaking things down, and some things resist being broken down. Some things are essentially whole and cannot be fully captured by their parts. Motion is one of those things. It is not reducible to a series of positions. Life is another. A living organism is not just a collection of molecules. It is a process, a dynamic, a pattern of organization that persists through constant change. You can analyze the parts, but the life is in the organization, in the flow, not in the static arrangement. Consciousness might be another. The experience of awareness, of being someone experiencing something, does not seem to be capturable by describing brain states. You can map every neuron, every synapse, every chemical signal, and still, the question of what it feels like to be conscious remains. Because consciousness is not a thing. It is a process, an ongoing, continuous flow of experience. And these things, motion, life, consciousness, all share a feature. They are temporal. They exist in time. They are not objects, but events. And events do not sit still. They unfold. They cannot be frozen without losing something essential. Zeno's paradoxes, in a way, are about this. About the difficulty of capturing the temporal with the atemporal, of describing flow with stillness, of understanding process through snapshots. And this difficulty is not just philosophical, it shows up in practical ways. In physics, it shows up in the difference between kinematics and dynamics. Kinematics describes motion without asking why it happens. Dynamics asks about forces, about causes. But even dynamics, which is more sophisticated, still works by dividing time into infinitesimal intervals and analyzing what happens in each one. It still treats motion as if it were built from tiny frozen moments. And this works. It produces accurate predictions. But it also involves a conceptual leap, an acceptance that the continuous can be approximated by the discrete, that the infinitesimal is a useful fiction, that limits and derivatives capture something real about change, even though they are defined in terms of approaching without arriving. Calculus is, in a sense, the mathematical resolution of Zeno's paradoxes. It provides the tools to handle infinity, to sum infinite series, to work with rates of change over infinitesimally small intervals. And it is one of the great intellectual achievements of human history. But it does not make the paradoxes go away. It just gives us a way to work with them, a way to calculate in spite of them. The strangeness remains. The fact that motion involves infinity remains. The fact that the continuous is not fully captured by the discrete remains. Calculus navigates these issues, but it does not dissolve them. It accepts them as features of reality and builds a framework that can handle them. And maybe this is the right attitude. Not to demand that reality conform to our intuitions, but to recognize that reality is what it is. And our job is to develop concepts and tools that can engage with it, even when it feels strange, even when it resists easy understanding. There is something humbling about this, about recognizing that the world is not obligated to make sense in the way we expect, that our concepts, however refined, are always approximations, that there will always be aspects of experience that slip through the net of language and logic. And yet, we keep building nets. We keep refining concepts because they are useful, because they allow us to navigate the world, to make predictions, to build technology, to communicate. The fact that they are imperfect does not make them worthless. It just means we should hold them lightly, should remember that they are tools, not truth, maps, not territory. Zeno's paradoxes remind us of this. They are a kind of conceptual alarm, ringing whenever we try to think too rigidly about motion, whenever we forget that our divisions are imposed, not discovered. They are a check on overconfidence, a reminder that the most ordinary things can be profoundly strange when examined closely. And this strangeness is not a defect. It is not something to be embarrassed about or to hide. It is part of the richness of reality, part of what makes the world worth thinking about. If everything was simple, if everything fit neatly into our concepts, there would be nothing left to wonder about. The fact that paradoxes persist, that strangeness remains even after explanation, is a sign that the world is deeper than our understanding, that there is always more to explore. Consider again the experience of walking. You stand, you intend to move. Somewhere in your brain, a decision is made, signals are sent, muscles contract, your weight shifts, your leg swings forward, your foot touches the ground, your weight transfers, and you have taken a step. Then another, and another, and soon you are walking. This is automatic. You do not think about it. You do not consciously control each muscle, each shift of weight. The process is smooth, integrated, unconscious. Walking is something your body knows how to do. But if you try to describe it, if you try to break it down into steps, it becomes complicated. There are dozens of muscles involved, hundreds of motor neurons firing in precise sequence. Balance must be maintained. Momentum must be controlled. The ground must be sensed and responded to. And all of this happens in real time, continuously, without pause. And underlying all of it is motion. The continuous change of position, the crossing of space. And underlying that is the same infinity that Zeno pointed to. Between any two positions of your foot, there are infinitely many intermediate positions. Your foot passes through all of them, smoothly, continuously, without ever pausing to count them. And your brain does not calculate this. It does not sum an infinite series. It does not solve differential equations. It just moves. It has learned, through years of experience, how to navigate space, how to make motion happen. And it does so without needing to understand the mathematics of it. This is worth pausing on. The fact that living organisms can move, can navigate, can respond to their environment without needing to understand the underlying principles. Motion is not something that had to wait for calculus to be invented. It is something that evolved millions of years before humans existed, before brains capable of abstract thought existed. Single-celled organisms can move. They respond to chemical gradients, to light, to touch. They do not have nervous systems. They do not have brains. But they move. They cross distances. They navigate space. And they do so without encountering paradoxes. The paradoxes are a human addition, a product of reflection, of trying to understand motion from the outside, from a detached, analytical perspective. The organism itself, living and moving, does not need that perspective. It is embedded in motion. It is motion. There is no paradox because there is no division between the mover and the moving. This suggests something interesting, that the paradoxes arise from a specific stance, a stance of separation, of standing outside the process and trying to describe it. But if you are inside the process, if you are the process, there is no paradox. There is only doing. And this is true for humans as well. When you walk, when you reach for something, when you turn your head, you are not troubled by paradoxes. You are simply moving. The paradoxes only appear when you stop moving and start thinking about moving, when you adopt the reflective stance. And the reflective stance is valuable. It is what allows for science, for mathematics, for philosophy. It is what allows us to build understanding, to see patterns, to make progress. But it has a cost. The cost is that it introduces a gap between the knower and the known, between the thinker and the thought. And in that gap, paradoxes can grow. This is not to say we should abandon reflection, but it is to say that reflection is not the only way of knowing. There is also the knowing of the body, the knowing that comes from doing, from being embedded in the world, from responding and adapting without needing to articulate what you are doing. An athlete knows their sport in this way. A musician knows their instrument. They have trained their bodies to respond, to move, to perform in ways that are too fast, too intricate to be consciously controlled. They have internalized the patterns, the rhythms, the flows. And when they perform, they are not thinking about what they are doing. They are simply doing it. They are inside the motion. And this kind of knowing does not generate paradoxes. It is preconceptual. It is direct. It is embodied. The paradoxes arise when you step back, when you try to capture this knowing in words, in concepts, in logical structures. And something is always lost in that translation. This is not a reason to reject concepts, but it is a reason to recognize their limits, to understand that there are ways of engaging with the world that do not go through language, that do not require analysis, and that these ways are not inferior, they are just different. They serve different purposes. The paradox of motion, then, might be less about motion itself and more about the difference between embodied knowing and conceptual knowing, about the gap between doing and describing. And perhaps the unease we feel when we encounter the paradox is a recognition of that gap, a sense that our descriptions, however refined, do not quite capture the lived reality of moving through space. And maybe that is okay. Maybe it is enough to recognize the gap, to acknowledge it, without needing to close it. To accept that some aspects of experience are richer, more textured, more immediate than any description can convey. And that motion is one of those aspects. You can describe motion. You can measure it, predict it, analyze it. But you can also just move. Just walk across a room. Just reach for a glass of water. Just turn your head to look at something. And in that moment of moving, there is no paradox. There is only the simplicity of being a body in space, responding to the world, navigating effortlessly through an infinity of points without needing to count them. And perhaps the paradox exists to remind us of this, to remind us that our concepts are tools, not the things themselves, that the world is more than our descriptions of it, that there is a richness to experience that exceeds what can be said. This is not mysticism. It is not a claim that reality is unknowable or that reason is futile. It is just a recognition that reason has a domain, and that domain, while large, is not infinite. There are things that reason handles well and things that it struggles with. And motion, with its continuity, its flow, its refusal to be fully divided, is one of the things it struggles with. But struggle is not failure. The struggle is productive. It leads to new concepts, new mathematics, new ways of thinking. Calculus emerged from the struggle to understand motion and change. Modern physics emerged from the struggle to reconcile motion with observation. The paradoxes were not obstacles to be avoided. They were provocations, invitations to think more deeply, more carefully, more creatively. And they continue to be. Even now, in contemporary physics, there are questions about the nature of space and time at the smallest scales. Whether space is continuous or discrete, whether time is fundamental or emergent, whether motion at the quantum level is the same kind of thing as motion at the macroscopic level. These are not settled questions. They are active areas of research. And they echo, in some ways, the concerns that Zeno raised about the relationship between continuity and discreteness, about whether our concepts of space and time are adequate to the phenomena, about what it means for something to move. And at the larger scales, too, there are puzzles. The universe is expanding. Galaxies are moving away from each other. But what does it mean for space itself to expand? What is it expanding into? Is there a background, a stage on which expansion happens? Or is space all there is, and expansion is something that space does, not something that happens to space? These questions do not have easy answers. They push at the limits of our current understanding, and they remind us that motion, even after centuries of thought and calculation, remains somewhat mysterious. Not unknowable, but not fully transparent either. There is always another layer, another question, another way in which the phenomenon resists being fully pinned down. And this might be true of many fundamental aspects of reality, that they are not simple, even when they seem simple, that they contain depths that are not immediately apparent, that the more closely you look, the stranger they become. Motion seems simple because it is ubiquitous. We see it everywhere. We do it constantly. It is so familiar that we take it for granted. But when you examine it closely, you try to understand what it really is, what it involves. It turns out to be anything but simple. It involves infinity. It involves continuity. It involves the relationship between time and change, between position and velocity, between the static and the dynamic. And none of these are simple concepts. They are rich, layered, subtle. They have been the subject of intense thought for millennia, and they remain, in some ways, elusive. Not because we lack intelligence or insight, but because they are genuinely deep, because the world is genuinely complex, because reality does not yield all its secrets easily, and maybe that is as it should be. If the world were simple, if it could be fully understood with a few concepts and a handful of equations, it would be boring. The fact that it is not, the fact that there are always more questions, always more puzzles, always more paradoxes, is what makes science and philosophy worthwhile. It is what keeps the inquiry alive. Zeno's paradoxes, from this perspective, are not problems to be solved and then forgotten. They are perennial questions, reminders of the strangeness woven into the fabric of reality. Reminders that even the most ordinary things, like walking across a room, are touched by infinity, are marked by mystery, are deeper than they appear. And engaging with these paradoxes is not about finding a final answer. It is about cultivating a certain kind of attention, a willingness to look closely at what is usually taken for granted, to question what seems obvious, to notice what is strange about the familiar. This kind of attention is rare. Most of the time, we move through the world without reflecting on it. We use concepts without questioning them. We navigate space and time without wondering what they are. And this is fine. This is necessary. We cannot stop and philosophize about every action. Life requires a certain amount of automaticity, a certain ease with the everyday. But occasionally, it is worth pausing, worth noticing, worth asking what is really happening when you take a step, when you reach out your hand, when you watch something move. And when you do, the paradoxes are there, waiting. Not as obstacles, but as invitations. Invitations to think more deeply, to see more clearly, to appreciate the strangeness and complexity of the world. And the strangeness is not threatening. It is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is interesting, that there are layers to reality that are not immediately visible, that the surface is not the whole story. Consider the experience of watching something fall. You drop an object, it falls. This is simple. This is obvious. Gravity pulls it down. It accelerates. It hits the ground. Done. But what is gravity? What is it for space to be curved, as general relativity says? What does it mean for an object to follow a geodesic, a straight line in curved space-time? These are not simple questions. They require sophisticated mathematics to even ask properly. And the answers, while precise, are also deeply strange. Space is not a container. It is not an empty stage. It is a dynamic field, shaped by mass and energy. And objects move through it, not because a force pushes them, but because the shape of space itself guides their motion. This is a radically different picture from the everyday intuition of gravity as a pull, and yet both are true in a sense. Gravity does pull in the sense that objects accelerate toward each other. But the mechanism, the reason why, is not a force in the traditional sense. It is the geometry of space-time. And even this description is a simplification. General relativity is a theory, a model. It is extraordinarily successful. It makes predictions that are confirmed to incredible precision. But it is not the final word. It is known to be incomplete. It does not incorporate quantum mechanics. It breaks down at singularities, at the centers of black holes, at the moment of the Big Bang. So even our best understanding of gravity, our best understanding of how objects move through space, is provisional. It is the best we have, but it is not the end of the story. There are still questions, still mysteries, still aspects of motion that we do not fully understand. And this is true across physics. Every theory, no matter how successful, has limits, boundaries beyond which it does not apply, or where it gives nonsensical answers. And at those boundaries, new physics is needed, new concepts, new mathematics, new ways of thinking about motion, space, time, matter. The history of physics is a history of discovering that things are stranger than they seemed. Newton's laws seemed final until they were not. They worked perfectly for the scales and speeds humans usually encounter. But at very high speeds, they fail. Special relativity is needed. At very strong gravitational fields, general relativity is needed. At very small scales, quantum mechanics is needed. And none of these theories quite fit together. They each describe their domain accurately, but they are not unified. There is no single framework that handles everything. And so, the quest continues. For a theory of quantum gravity. For a unified understanding of all forces. For a complete picture of motion at all scales, from the smallest particles to the largest structures in the universe. And underlying all of this is the same basic phenomenon that Zeno noticed. The phenomenon of motion, of change, of things moving from one place to another, one state to another. It is the most fundamental fact about the universe. Nothing stays still. Everything is in motion. And yet, after millennia of thought, we still do not fully understand what motion is. We can describe it, we can predict it, we can manipulate it. But the deep question, the question of what it really means for something to move, remains open. Not unanswerable, but not fully answered either. It is a question that every generation revisits, with new tools, new insights, new perspectives. And this is not a failure. It is the nature of deep questions. They are not solved once and for all. They are engaged with, wrestled with, understood more fully over time, but they never completely close. There is always more to say, more to discover, more to wonder about. And motion is one of these questions. It is so basic, so foundational, that it touches everything. Every process, every change, every event involves motion in some sense. And so understanding motion is, in a way, understanding the universe itself. Understanding how things can change, how they can become something other than what they were, how time can pass and things can be different. And change is perhaps even more fundamental than motion, because motion is a kind of change of position. But there are other kinds of change, a change of temperature, a change of phase, from solid to liquid to gas, a change of color, a change of state, from alive to dead, from ordered to disordered. All of these are changes, and all of them involve time. They happen over time. They are temporal processes. And all of them raise the same kinds of questions that motion raises. What is happening in between the before and the after? Is the change continuous or discrete? Is it smooth or stepwise? Is there a smallest unit of change? Or can change be divided infinitely, just like motion can? These are not idle questions. They have practical implications. In chemistry, for instance, reactions happen through sequences of intermediate states. Molecules collide, bonds break, new bonds form. Each of these is a kind of change, and understanding the details, the exact pathway from reactants to products, is crucial for predicting how fast a reaction will happen, what conditions will favor it, whether it will proceed at all. And the same is true in biology. Life is change. Organisms grow, develop, respond, adapt. Cells divide, proteins fold, genes are expressed. All of these are dynamic processes. All of them involve motion at the molecular level and change at higher levels of organization. And understanding life means understanding these processes, these flows, these patterns of change that persist over time. And in every case, the same issues arise. The same tension between the continuous and the discrete. The same question of how to describe flow with concepts built for stillness. The same paradoxes lurking in the background, reminding us that our descriptions are always approximations. But again, approximation is not failure. It is how knowledge works. We build models, we test them, we refine them, we find their limits and build better models. And the process continues. There is no final model, no ultimate description that captures everything perfectly. There is only the ongoing work of understanding, the endless process of looking more closely, thinking more carefully, asking better questions. And in the middle of this process, we live, we move, we change, we experience. And the experience is always richer than the description. Always more immediate, more textured, more whole. The description captures aspects, but never the totality. It freezes moments, but never the flow. It divides, but never quite conveys the unity. And so we live in two worlds, in a sense. The world of experience, where motion is simple and immediate and effortless. And the world of thought, where motion is complex and puzzling and paradoxical. And these two worlds do not quite align. There is a gap between them. A gap that cannot be fully closed, but can be navigated, explored, understood better. And maybe the value of paradoxes like Zeno's is that they make this gap visible. They point to it. They say, look, here is a place where thought and experience diverge. Here is a place where the concepts we use do not quite fit the phenomena they are meant to describe. And this is not a problem to be solved, but a feature to be noticed. A reminder that the world is not made of concepts, that concepts are our tools for engaging with the world, but they are not the world itself. And this has practical implications. It means we should hold our concepts lightly, should be willing to revise them, to let them go, to build new ones when the old ones no longer serve. It means we should not mistake the map for the territory, should not confuse our descriptions with the things described. It means we should stay humble, stay curious, stay open to the possibility that things are stranger and richer than we currently understand. And it means we should pay attention to the paradoxes, not dismiss them as errors or confusions, but engage with them. See what they have to teach us. Use them as guides to the places where our understanding is incomplete, where the world resists our attempts to pin it down. Because the world does resist. Not out of malice, not because it is hiding something, but simply because it is what it is. And what it is vastly more complex, more intricate, more layered than any description can fully convey. We can learn more, we can understand better, but we will never exhaust it. There will always be more to discover, more to wonder about, more to be puzzled by. And motion, with its paradoxes and its strangeness, is a microcosm of this. It is everywhere. It is fundamental. And it is, when you look closely, deeply strange. Not incomprehensible, but not simple either. It is a reminder that the ordinary is extraordinary, that the familiar is full of mystery, that the world we live in, the world we move through every day, is more wonderful and more puzzling than it first appears. And perhaps that is the real lesson of Zeno's paradoxes. Not that motion is impossible, not that space and time are illusions, but that reality is deeper than it looks. That the most basic facts of existence, the things we take most for granted, are touched by infinity, by continuity. Questions that have occupied some of the best minds in history and still remain, in some sense, open. And we get to live in this reality. We get to move through it, to experience it, to think about it. We get to be puzzled by it, to be amazed by it, to keep asking questions even when the answers are elusive. And that is a privilege. That is what makes being a conscious, thinking, moving creature worthwhile. The opportunity to engage with a world that is endlessly rich, endlessly complex, endlessly surprising. And as you move through this world, as you walk across a room, as you reach for something, as you watch things change and flow around you, you are participating in something ancient and ongoing. You are crossing infinities. You are navigating continuities. You are doing what countless organisms have done for billions of years. You are moving. And in that simple act, that most ordinary of acts, there is a depth, a strangeness, a beauty that is easy to miss, but always there, waiting to be noticed. The experience of approaching something is different from the experience of having arrived. There is a tension in approach, a sense of anticipation. The distance ahead holds a kind of promise, but also a kind of resistance. It is there, it is real, and it must be crossed. And as you cross it, as you move toward whatever it is you are approaching, there is a feeling of progress. You are getting closer. The distance is shrinking. But the distance never vanishes all at once. It diminishes gradually. And if you pay attention to this, if you notice it as it happens, there is a texture to it, a grain, a sense that the closing of distance is not a single event, but a process, a sequence, or perhaps a flow, depending on how you think about it. And this is where the paradox lives, in the gap between sequence and flow, in the question of whether motion is made of steps or is seamless. And the answer, frustratingly, is both, or neither. Or it depends on how you look. Because motion is seamless. It feels seamless. When you move your hand from here to there, you do not feel it jump. You do not feel it passing through discrete positions. You feel a smooth arc, a continuous transition. And this is not an illusion. This is what motion is like. This is the texture of experience. But when you think about motion, when you try to describe it, you divide it. You say, first the hand was here, then it was there. You identify positions, moments, stages. And this is not wrong. This is useful. This is how analysis works. But it introduces something that was not present in the experience. It introduces division where there was unity. And the paradox arises from trying to reconcile these two perspectives, trying to make the divided description match the undivided experience. And they do not quite match. They cannot quite match. Because they are different kinds of things. One is lived, the other is thought. One is direct, the other is mediated. One is immediate, the other is reflective. And this is not a failure of thought. It is just a recognition of its nature. Thought works by making distinctions, by separating things, by analyzing them into parts. This is its power. But it also means that some things, some aspects of experience, will not be fully captured by thought, will remain partially outside its grasp. And motion is one of these things. Not completely outside, not incomprehensible, but not completely inside either. Not fully transparent. There is always a remainder, a residue, a sense that something about the experience exceeds the description. And maybe this is why the paradoxes feel unsettling, because they point to this remainder. They make visible the gap between experience and explanation. And we are not used to such gaps. We are used to thinking that if we understand something, really understand it, then it should stop feeling strange. But that is not always true. Sometimes understanding reveals strangeness. Sometimes the more you know, the stranger things become. This is certainly true in physics. The more we have learned about the universe, the stranger it has turned out to be. Quantum mechanics is strange. Relativity is strange. Dark matter and dark energy are strange. The Big Bang is strange. Black holes are strange. None of these things match our everyday intuitions. All of them require us to accept that reality is not the way it seems at first glance. And yet, we have accepted them. Not because they feel comfortable, but because they are supported by evidence. Because they make predictions that are confirmed. Because they are the best explanations we have. And we have learned to live with the strangeness, to incorporate it into our understanding, even if it never quite feels natural. And maybe that is what we need to do with the paradoxes of motion. Accept them as features of the landscape, as markers of the places where reality is not quite what we expect. Not because there is anything wrong with reality, but because our expectations are based on limited experience, on a narrow range of phenomena, on concepts that were developed for practical purposes rather than deep truth. We developed concepts like distance and time and motion to navigate the world, to survive, to thrive, and they work for that purpose. They work very well. But they were not designed to be metaphysically precise. They were designed to be useful. And sometimes, usefulness and precision diverge. A useful concept is one that helps you do things, predict outcomes, make plans, coordinate with others. It does not need to be perfectly accurate. It just needs to be good enough. And most of our concepts are like this. They are good enough for the tasks we face, but not perfect. And when we turn these concepts on themselves, when we use them to analyze the very processes they were designed to help us navigate, we start to see their limits. We start to see places where they fray, where they produce paradoxes, where they do not quite work. And this is not a reason to abandon them, but it is a reason to be aware of their limits, to know when to use them and when to look for something better, to remember that they are tools, not truths. And sometimes the best response to a paradox is not to solve it, but to acknowledge it, to say, yes, this is strange, yes, this is hard to think about. Yes, there is a gap here between what I experience and what I can explain. And that is okay. That is part of what it means to be a finite creature trying to understand an infinite reality. Because reality is infinite in many senses. Space may be infinite. Time may be infinite. The number of possible configurations of matter may be infinite. The divisibility of space and time seems to be infinite. And we are finite. Our minds are finite. Our concepts are finite. Our lifespans are finite. And so there will always be aspects of reality that exceed our grasp. Not because we are stupid or lazy, but because we are finite and reality is not. And this is humbling. It is a reminder that we are not the measure of all things, that the universe does not exist to make sense to us, that our understanding, however advanced, will always be partial. But partial understanding is still understanding. It is still valuable. It is still worth pursuing. We do not need to understand everything to understand something. We do not need to solve all paradoxes to make progress. We can live with uncertainty, with strangeness, with gaps in our knowledge, and still build, still discover, still create. And in fact, the gaps are often where the most interesting work happens, where new ideas emerge, where creativity is required, where the old concepts are pushed to their limits and new ones are forged. Calculus emerged from grappling with the paradoxes of motion. Quantum mechanics emerged from grappling with the paradoxes of light and matter. General relativity emerged from grappling with the paradoxes of gravity and acceleration. In each case, the paradox was not an obstacle, but a catalyst, a sign that something new was needed, that the old ways of thinking were insufficient. And so, the paradoxes of motion, far from being problems to be solved and forgotten, are invitations to keep thinking, to keep questioning, to keep refining our understanding. They are permanent features of the landscape because they point to something fundamental about the relationship between thought and reality. And that relationship is not static. It evolves. As we develop new tools, new concepts, new ways of thinking, we see reality differently. We notice things we did not notice before. We ask questions we did not know how to ask. And the paradoxes shift, but they do not disappear. They reappear in new forms, in new contexts, reminding us that the work is never done. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the work is not supposed to be done. Maybe the value is in the doing, not in the completion. In the ongoing engagement with reality, the perpetual refinement of understanding, the endless conversation between mind and world. And motion, as the most basic form of change, as the foundation of all process, all dynamics, all life, is a fitting subject for this conversation. It is simple enough to be accessible, complex enough to be endlessly interesting, and strange enough to keep us humble. When you walk, you are engaging in something that has been done for hundreds of millions of years. Walking, or something like it, evolved early. Before brains, before consciousness, before thought, there was motion. Single cells moved. They found food, avoided danger, navigated their environment. They did not understand motion. They did not need to. They simply did it. And we still do it. Most of the time, we walk without thinking. We move without analyzing. We navigate space unconsciously, effortlessly, automatically. The body knows how. The neural circuits are wired, refined by evolution and by individual practice, to make motion smooth and reliable. But we also have the capacity to reflect, to step back and ask, what am I doing when I walk? What is motion? What is space? And when we do this, when we turn our reflective attention on the most basic acts, we encounter strangeness. We find that what seems simple is not simple. What seemed obvious is not obvious. And this is the human condition. To be both inside and outside experience. To live in the world and to think about the world. To do things and to wonder why they are possible. To move through space and to be puzzled by what space is. And there is a tension in this. The doing and the wondering pull in different directions. Doing requires immersion, engagement, a kind of forgetting of the self. Wondering requires distance, detachment, a stepping back. And we oscillate between these modes. Sometimes we are fully present, fully engaged, lost in the doing. Sometimes we are detached, observing, analyzing, trying to understand. And both are valuable. Both are necessary. Without doing, without engagement, there would be nothing to understand. Without wondering, without reflection, there would be no understanding. The two are complementary. They need each other. But they also create friction. The reflective stance can disrupt the flow of doing. If you think too much about how to walk, you might stumble. If you think too much about how to speak, your words might falter. The doing has its own rhythm, its own logic, and conscious thought can interfere with it. This is well known in sports, in music, in any skilled performance. There is a state called flow, where you are fully engaged, where action and awareness merge, where there is no gap between intention and execution. And this state is disrupted by self-consciousness, by thinking about what you are doing instead of just doing it. And yet, to improve, to refine, to master a skill, you need reflection. You need to step back, analyze, identify what is working and what is not, and make adjustments. So the process alternates. Practice, then reflect. Do, then analyze. And over time, the doing becomes more skilled, more automatic, and the reflection becomes more insightful, more precise. And this applies to thinking about motion too. We can move without thinking about it. Most of the time we do. But occasionally we can pause, reflect, notice what is strange about what we usually take for granted. And this reflection, while it does not change the doing, can enrich it, can make us more aware, more appreciative, more curious. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the goal is not to resolve all paradoxes, not to achieve perfect understanding, but simply to notice, to pay attention, to be aware of the strangeness and the beauty woven into the fabric of ordinary experience. Because the strangeness is there, whether we notice it or not. The infinity is there, the continuity is there, the mystery is there. It is not created by reflection, it is revealed by reflection. And in that revelation, there is a kind of enrichment, a deepening of experience, a sense that the world is more than we thought, that reality has layers we had not suspected. And this sense, this openness to strangeness, to mystery, to the unknown, is perhaps one of the most valuable things we can cultivate. Because it is the antidote to complacency, to the assumption that we already know enough, that we have already understood enough. It keeps us humble, keeps us curious, keeps us engaged. And it is especially important in a world that is increasingly complex, increasingly interconnected, increasingly full of things that resist easy understanding. The problems we face, the questions we ask, the technologies we develop, all of these are growing more intricate, more layered, more difficult to grasp. And if we approach them with the assumption that everything should be simple, that everything should make immediate sense, we will be frustrated and overwhelmed. But if we approach them with the recognition that complexity is real, that strangeness is a feature, not a bug, that understanding is an ongoing process rather than a final state, then we can navigate more skillfully. We can tolerate ambiguity. We can sit with uncertainty. We can engage with questions that do not have quick answers. And the paradoxes of motion, in their own small way, are training for this. They teach us that things can be true and strange at the same time, that we can understand something and still find it puzzling, that explanation and wonder are not opposites but companions. And they remind us that the most fundamental aspects of reality, the things we depend on every moment of every day, are not transparent. They have depth, they have texture. They resist being fully captured by our concepts. And that is not a weakness of the concepts or a defect of reality. It is just the way things are. Reality is what it is, and we are creatures within it, trying to make sense of it, using the tools we have. And those tools are imperfect, but they are all we have. And so, we do the best we can. We build models, test them, refine them. We ask questions, seek answers, ask better questions. We notice strangeness, investigate it, learn from it. And in the process, we change. Our understanding deepens, our concepts sharpen, our sense of what is possible expands. And the world, which seemed familiar, becomes strange again. And the strange, with time and effort, becomes familiar, and the cycle continues. And motion is at the center of this cycle, Because motion is change, and change is what the cycle is. The process of learning, of understanding, of growing, is itself a kind of motion, a movement from one state of knowledge to another, a crossing of conceptual distance. And it too involves infinities. Infinities of questions, of possible paths, of things to learn. And we move through this space, step by step, or perhaps continuously, and we never quite arrive at complete understanding, but we keep moving anyway, because that is what living things do. They move, they change, they respond to their environment, they adapt, they grow. And motion, in the physical sense, is a manifestation of this deeper principle, that life is not static, that it is dynamic, that it is a process, not a thing. And consciousness, too, is a process, a stream, as William James called it, not a sequence of discrete thoughts, but a continuous flow of experience. And within that flow, there are moments of clarity, moments of confusion, moments of insight, moments of wonder. But they are not separate. They blend into each other. They are phases of a single, ongoing process. And when we reflect on this process, when we try to understand our own consciousness, we encounter the same kinds of issues that arise with motion. How do we divide the continuous flow into discrete thoughts? How do we identify the boundaries between one experience and another? Where does one moment end and the next begin? These questions do not have clear answers. Consciousness does not come pre-divided. We impose divisions on it, for practical purposes, for communication, for memory. But the divisions are artificial. Useful, but artificial. The underlying reality is continuous. And so, consciousness, like motion, resists full analysis. It can be studied, it can be measured. Brain states can be correlated with experiences. But the flow of experience itself, the what it is likeness of being conscious, remains somewhat elusive. Not because it is supernatural or immaterial, but because it is a continuous process, and continuous processes do not fit neatly into the discrete categories we use to think about them. And this is a theme that runs through many areas of inquiry. Whenever we try to understand processes, flows, dynamics, we encounter this issue. The tools we have, the concepts we use, are built for things, not processes, for objects, not changes. And so, we have to adapt them, stretch them, refine them to handle the dynamic, the temporal, the continuous, and we have made progress. Calculus gave us the tools to handle continuous change. Differential equations let us model dynamic systems. Phase space gives us a way to visualize processes. Topology gives us ways to think about continuity without relying on coordinates. These are all conceptual innovations, ways of extending our thinking to handle what does not fit neatly into the old categories. But they are still extensions, still adaptations. They work by approximating, by finding clever ways to apply discrete methods to continuous phenomena, and this works remarkably well. But it also means that the gap is still there, just better managed. The tension between the continuous and the discrete has not been eliminated, only navigated more skillfully. And maybe elimination is not the goal. Maybe the tension is productive. Maybe it is the source of the creativity, the ingenuity, the innovation that has driven so much progress in mathematics and science. The need to handle continuity with discrete tools forces us to be clever, to invent new concepts, to see things in new ways. And so, the paradoxes, the tensions, the gaps are not just problems. They are also opportunities. Opportunities to think more deeply, to see more clearly, to develop richer understandings. And in that sense, they are gifts, invitations to grow, to change, to move toward better understanding, even if we never quite arrive. And this movement toward understanding, this crossing of conceptual distance, is itself a kind of motion. A motion of the mind through a space of ideas. And it has the same character as physical motion. It is continuous. It unfolds over time. It involves crossing infinities of intermediate steps. And it never quite finishes. Because there is always more to understand. Always another question. Always another layer. The space of possible knowledge is vast, perhaps infinite. And we move through it, step by step, or continuously, driven by curiosity, by wonder, by the desire to make sense of things. And along the way, we encounter paradoxes, places where our concepts do not quite fit, where the territory exceeds the map. And we can respond to these in different ways. We can be frustrated by them, see them as obstacles, or we can be intrigued by them, see them as signs that we are approaching something interesting, something deep, something worth thinking about. And the paradoxes of motion, which have persisted for millennia, which have been revisited by every generation, which still feel strange even after all the advances in mathematics and physics, are among the most enduring of these signs. They mark a place where reality and thought meet in an uneasy relationship, where the world does not quite conform to our expectations, where strangeness persists despite explanation. And engaging with them is not about solving them. It is about learning from them, about recognizing what they reveal about the nature of motion, the nature of thought, the nature of understanding itself. About seeing them as windows into the deep structure of reality, into the relationship between the continuous and the discrete, the infinite and the finite, the dynamic and the static. And in this way, they are not just about motion, they are about everything, about how we understand anything, about the process of inquiry itself, about what it means to be a thinking creature in a complex world. And as you sit here, as you read these words, you are engaged in a process of understanding, good night, of following a thread of thought, of moving through conceptual space. And that process is continuous. It flows. One word leads to the next, one idea to another, and the meaning accumulates gradually, not in discrete jumps, but in a smooth progression. And yet, if you think about it, you are reading discrete words, discrete letters, discrete symbols. And somehow, from these discrete elements, a continuous flow of meaning emerges. The words are separate, but the sense is whole. The text is divided, but the understanding is unified. And this is another version of the same paradox. The continuous arising from the discrete, the smooth emerging from the fragmented, the unity appearing from the parts. And it happens because the parts are not really separate. They are connected. They form a pattern. And the pattern is what carries the meaning, not the individual elements. The meaning is not in the words themselves, but in their relationships, their order, their context. And relationships, order, context, these are continuous things. They span the discrete elements and unify them into a whole. And the same is true of motion. The positions are discrete, in a sense. You can identify specific locations. But the motion is not in the positions. It is in the relationships between them, in the transition from one to the next. And that transition is continuous. It is what makes motion motion, rather than a series of static snapshots. And so the paradox dissolves, not because we solve it, but because we see it differently. We see that the discrete and the continuous are not opposites, but aspects. Different ways of looking at the same thing. Different levels of description. And both are valid. Both are useful. But neither is the whole story. The whole story, if there is one, involves both. Involves seeing how the discrete and the continuous fit together, how they complement each other, how they are two sides of the same coin. And this is a deeper understanding than either alone. It is a recognition that reality is richer than any single perspective can capture. That to understand something fully, we need multiple perspectives, multiple levels, multiple ways of seeing. And this is hard. It requires holding complexity. It requires resisting the urge to simplify, to reduce, to pick one perspective and ignore the others. It requires being comfortable with ambiguity, with tension, with the fact that different descriptions can be true at the same time, even if they do not seem to fit together neatly. But this is what reality demands. It is complex. It is layered. It does not reduce to a single simple story. And if we want to understand it, we have to engage with that complexity. We have to learn to hold multiple perspectives, to see how they relate, to appreciate the richness that comes from their interaction. And the paradoxes of motion are a training ground for this. They force us to hold two perspectives at once, the perspective of discrete steps and the perspective of continuous flow, and to see that both are true in different ways, and that the strangeness arises not from either perspective alone, but from trying to reconcile them. And maybe reconciliation is not the right goal. Maybe the goal is simply to appreciate both, to see the value in each, to understand when to use one and when to use the other, to recognize that they are different tools, different lenses, different ways of engaging with the phenomenon of motion. And in that recognition, there is a kind of peace, a release from the need to have one final answer, one ultimate perspective, an acceptance that reality is multifaceted, that understanding is perspectival, that truth is richer and more complex than any single statement can convey. And this acceptance is not resignation. It is not giving up on understanding. It is a deeper understanding, an understanding that includes the limits of understanding itself, a recognition that we are finite creatures grappling with infinite complexity, and that our grasp will always be partial, but that partial understanding is still valuable, still meaningful, still worth pursuing. And so we continue. We move forward, even though we never quite arrive. We ask questions, even though the answers raise more questions. We seek understanding, even though understanding reveals further mysteries. And in this ongoing process, in this perpetual motion toward deeper insight, we find meaning, we find purpose, we find engagement with something larger than ourselves. And motion, the simple act of moving from here to there, is a microcosm of this larger process. It is ordinary and extraordinary, familiar and strange, simple and profound. It is something we do without thinking, and something that, when we do think about it, reveals layers of complexity and mystery. And perhaps the value of thinking about motion, of engaging with its paradoxes, is not to solve them or to understand motion completely. Perhaps the value is simply in the engagement itself, in the act of paying attention, of noticing, of wondering, in the cultivation of a certain kind of awareness, a sensitivity to the strangeness and beauty of the world. Because the world is strange, it is beautiful, it is far more intricate, far more subtle, far more wonderful than we usually notice. And most of the time, We move through it without seeing, without really looking. We are busy, distracted, focused on tasks and goals and plans. And that is fine. That is necessary. But occasionally, it is worth pausing, worth slowing down, worth looking closely at what is usually taken for granted. And when we do, when we really pay attention, what we find is astonishing. The ordinary is not ordinary. The familiar is not familiar. The simple is not simple. There are depths everywhere, mysteries everywhere, wonders everywhere. And we get to explore them. We get to ask questions, to seek answers, to be surprised, to be puzzled, to be amazed. And this is a gift, a privilege, an opportunity that we should not take for granted. To be conscious, to be curious, to be capable of wonder. To be able to look at something as mundane as motion and see in it infinity, continuity, paradox, beauty. And as you move through your day, as you walk and reach and turn, as you watch things move around you, perhaps you can carry a bit of this awareness with you. Not constantly, that would be exhausting, but occasionally, in moments. A recognition that what you are doing, what you are seeing, is strange and wonderful. That motion is a mystery you participate in. That crossing a room is traversing an infinity. That the most ordinary act is touched by the profound. And in those moments, perhaps the world will feel different, more alive, more present, more real. Not because anything has changed, but because you have noticed what was always there. The strangeness, the wonder, the infinite complexity woven into the simplest things. And that noticing is itself a kind of motion, a movement of attention, a shift of perspective, a crossing from taking things for granted to seeing them freshly. And it is a motion worth making, again and again, as often as you can remember. Because on the other side of that motion is a richer experience, a deeper engagement, a fuller presence in the world. And the world, in its infinite complexity, in its endless strangeness, in its perpetual motion, is waiting to be noticed, waiting to be wondered at, waiting to be engaged with, not just practically, not just instrumentally, but for its own sake, for the sake of understanding, of appreciation, of connection. And motion, as the most fundamental expression of change, as the process by which everything in the universe unfolds, is perhaps the most fitting place to begin this noticing, to begin this wondering, to begin this deeper engagement. Because when you really look at motion, when you really pay attention to what it is and what it involves, you see not just motion, you see time, you see space, you see continuity, you see infinity. You see the relationship between thought and reality. You see the limits of concepts and the richness of experience. You see paradox and wonder and mystery. You see, in short, the world, the real world. The world that is more than we usually notice, more than we usually think about, more than we usually engage with, but which is always there, waiting, offering itself, inviting us to look, to wonder, to explore. And all it takes is a moment, a pause, a willingness to notice, to see what is actually happening when you take a step, when you reach out, when you watch something fall, to see the strangeness in the ordinary, the infinite in the finite, the mysterious in the familiar. And in that seeing, something shifts. Not in the world, but in you. Your relationship to the world deepens. Your experience enriches. Your sense of what is possible expands. And you become more alive, more awake, more present. And that aliveness, that awakeness, that presence is perhaps what we are really after. Not answers, not solutions, not the resolution of all paradoxes, but a deeper, richer, more engaged way of being in the world. A way that recognizes complexity without being overwhelmed by it, that acknowledges mystery without being paralyzed by it, that sees strangeness and meets it with curiosity rather than fear. And motion, with all its paradoxes and all its depths, is a teacher of this way of being. It shows us that things can be understood and still remain strange, that explanation does not eliminate wonder, that the more we know, the more there is to know, that arrival is not the point, that the motion toward understanding is itself the purpose. And so we move, we keep moving, toward better understanding, deeper insight, richer experience. And we never quite arrive. The distance keeps unfolding, the questions keep multiplying, the mysteries keep deepening. And that is not a failure. That is the nature of the journey. That is what makes it worth taking. And perhaps, in the end, that is what Zeno was really showing us. Not that motion is impossible, but that it is inexhaustible. That no matter how much we understand, there is always more. That the crossing of distance, whether physical or conceptual, is an infinite task. Not because it cannot be done, but because it can never be finished. There is always another step, another question, another layer. And we take those steps. We ask those questions. We explore those layers. Not because we expect to reach an end, but because the exploration itself is meaningful. Because motion is not about arriving, it is about moving. And understanding is not about final answers, it is about asking better questions. And so the motion continues, the wonder continues, the exploration continues. And in that continuing, in that ongoing, in that perpetual incompleteness, there is a kind of completeness. A wholeness that comes not from having all the answers, but from engaging fully with the questions. From moving through the infinite with attention, with curiosity, with openness. And the distance ahead, which seemed like an obstacle, becomes an invitation. The gap that remains becomes not a frustration, but a promise. A promise that there is always more to discover, more to wonder about, more to explore, and that the motion toward that more, the crossing of that distance, is what gives life its texture, its depth, its meaning. And so we step forward, again, and again, and the distance closes, and the distance remains, and both are true. And in that truth, in that paradox, in that tension between arrival and motion, between completion and continuation, between the finite and the infinite, we find ourselves, moving, always moving, never quite arriving, and somehow, mysteriously, arriving all the time. Good night.